I'm just going to fill in with just a brief explanation of how Joe Rosenstein and I met. There's a woman in our community, Thelma Bartner, may her memory be blessed. She moved here from New Jersey and became a very close friend to my mother in her last months of her life. And Thelma, when she was living in New Jersey, happened to belong to Joe's chavurah, coincidentally. And we had come across Joe's book a couple of years before that. We loved his Machzor, his holiday prayer book, High Holiday prayer book. And she goes, "I know that guy." And actually, when we first ordered Joe's books, we had some nice conversations. This is a little over 10 years ago. And then Joe, because of the connection with Thelma, and having some nice interactions with Joe, we invited him to come up to Maine, and he reminded me that he came up the best time to come, which was the peak season of the foliage, and that was 10 years ago. And we've had communications off and on over the years, and then he wrote this the book that he'll speak about tonight, and it helped us reconnect once again. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to go over just a few ground rules about tonight. So for those people who are familiar with Zoom, if you look on your screen to reactions on the bottom right, on maybe the second to last on the right, there's something that you could do which is called raised hand. And you'll see on my left-hand side, my hand is raised. Zoom has made it such that people who raise their hand now will go to the front of the line in order. So during Joe's presentation, he'll be stopping intermittently to see if there's any comments or questions that people have. And I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand, and then I'll call on you and unmute yourself. You can ask the question. Now, there may be some people who are not comfortable with that Zoom link or whatever, and if it's not working out for you, then feel free to raise your hand. And if for some reason I don't see that the hand's raised, someone else feel free to saying, "Oh, Alan Fink has raised his hand. He doesn't know how to work a computer." So, so just so you know, so everyone gets a chance. So, this it is our privilege in our community to have Joe be able to do this. Zoom has enabled us to get people from all over the country to participate in things, and for Joe to be able to do this from the comfort of his home, which is wonderful. So, Joe, I'm going to have you take it away.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank David Strassler and also Congregation Etz Chaim for inviting me to do this session. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this evening's Zoom program. So I'm going to start by putting Pirkei Avot in context. Some of you may know a great deal about it already. Some of you may have studied it, but some of you may not have. So the earliest remarks will be introductory. Avot is a small section of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was compiled in about the year 200 of the Common Era, 1800 years ago, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, based on initial work done by Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, and others in previous generations. During the Passover Seder, we sing, "Who knows six?" Six are the books of the Mishnah. Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. The Mishnah does have 6 books. These 6 books are divided into about 75 parts, one of which is called Avot. So Avot is indeed a very small section of the Mishnah. The focus of the Mishnah as a whole is halacha, regulations for the new version of Judaism, which was created by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. Avot is the only portion of the Mishnah that has no halacha. Instead, it contains ethical teachings, advice to judges and would-be judges, advice to Torah scholars and would-be Torah scholars, and aphorisms addressed to the general population. The teachers in Avot span 500 years, from about 300 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era, 500 years. There are 5 chapters in Avot, containing the teachings of almost 70 sages, presented approximately in chronological order. The later sages had to reconstruct from memory what the earlier sages had said, since they could not interview them, obviously. There were no recordings of their voices, and their teachings were likely not written. Let's fast forward 1,000 years. About 1,000 years ago, the practice originated of studying one chapter of Avot on each Shabbat between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, Shabbat always occurs exactly 6 times during that period, and Avot has only 5 chapters. So what happened was they added a 6th chapter, and perhaps when that happened, the resulting collection was first called Pirkei Avot. I'm not sure of that, but I suspect that may have been true. What is the appeal of Pirkei Avot? Why has this practice of reciting a chapter every week during the summer proved to be enduring? Why has this part of the Mishnah captured the attention and the loyalty of the Jewish people? Well, certainly the focus of most Jews has been on the ethical teachings of Pirkei Avot, and only to a lesser extent on the other teachings. From the issues discussed and from the advice given in the ethical teachings, we learn that human nature has not changed all that much over the past 2,000 years. We still have to deal with such issues as anger, respect, gratitude, humility, desires, all things that they had to deal with back then. And the advice given is, for the most part, very wise. So the teachers in Pirkei Avot were, for the most part, wise men whose wisdom has endured for 2 millennia. What is also amazing is that these sages lived in terrible times. The Holy Temple and the Holy City of Jerusalem had been destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. And the Holocaust that took place 60 years later was second only to the Holocaust of our times. Many of us think of the Holocaust every day, even though it happened 75 years ago. They too must have wept every day over their destruction. Yes, yet the post-traumatic stress that they must have experienced is absent from Pirkei Avot. Like the Mishnah as a whole, Pirkei Avot is very upbeat and forward-looking, part of the conscious effort to build a new version of Judaism to replace the one that was destroyed, to build a new version of Judaism that would last for thousands of years. I remember as a youngster studying Pirkei Avot on Shabbat afternoon in the spring with my Rebbe on his tiny porch. We went through Pirkei Avot, one Mishnah after another, as it is commonly studied and as it is commonly presented in commentaries in Pirkei Avot. So in an hour or two on Shabbat afternoon, we could study all of the teachings in one chapter of Pirkei Avot. The title of my book is Reflections on Pirkei Avot, not just what my Rebbe taught me. So here's, many of you already have a copy of it, but for those who don't, I'll show you a copy of it. It looks like this. Of course, you can't tell what's in it by the cover, as I'll shortly mention, but that's what it is. Reflections on Pirkei Avot, not just what my Rebbe taught me. Before I talk about my book, I should first say that my Rebbe, whose name was Rebbe Gedalia Cohen, Alav HaShalom, must have taught me well, because I internalized many of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. For example, the first time I went to Israel in the 1960s, I had a discussion on the train with a rabbi who reprimanded me for my hippie-like appearance. You could never tell by looking at me now that I once looked like a hippie, but it was so. I responded, Al tistakel bakankan ela b'masha yesh bo, which means don't focus on the bottle, but what is inside it. That's a lovely editorial comment in Pirkei Avot by the editor of the Mishnah. I'm sure that this rabbi was very surprised that this hippie could quote Pirkei Avot. I also learned Ein habayishan lomed. One who is embarrassed to ask questions cannot learn. So I learned from Pirkei Avot that I should always ask questions. I would always ask, what does this mean? Why is this so? How do you justify this claim? Asking such questions has been fundamental in my approach to Judaism, as you can see in the Siddur and the Machzor, and also to mathematics. And when an Orthodox colleague of mine gleefully informed me many years ago that the then president of Egypt had died, I said to myself, isn't he aware that it says in Pirkei Avot, B'nefol oyevecha al tismach, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice? Although I learned to ask questions from Pirkei Avot, one kind of question that my Rebbe did not discuss with me was, why would Shmuel HaKatan, the name of the sage, have taught that one should not rejoice at the fall of one's enemies? My sense is that when such a warning comes about, that happens because people were behaving in exactly the way that was being described. Shmuel HaKatan's cautionary remark is actually a quote from Proverbs. So he must have felt some urgency in repeating a biblical verse. What was the urgency? What could the people have been rejoicing about in those years following the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem? So that's the question I asked myself. And it turns out that I found what may be an answer. It turns out that 9 years later, 9 years after the destruction of the temple, the eruption of Vesuvius destroyed the great Roman city of Pompeii. Perhaps there was a great rejoicing about that. Perhaps people might have joyfully proclaimed, you destroyed our city, now God has destroyed yours. Is that what actually happened? Was Shmuel HaKatan discouraging the glee of some of his comrades? I don't know, but I suspect that that did happen. There are many other teachings in Pirkei Avot where the context may be relevant. My Rebbe didn't discuss with me the context of the teachings, probably because his Rebbe didn't discuss the context of the teachings with him either. And his Rebbe's Rebbe didn't either. Let me pause for a moment to see if there are any comments or questions. Okay, I'll go ahead. A lot of context was happening during the 500 years of Avot. First, there was life under Persian rule, then under Greek rule, then under Roman rule. There were conflicts between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, between the schools of Hillel and Shammai, and of course, the rise of Christianity. There was the rebellion of the Maccabees, which was successful, as we know, and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, which was unsuccessful. As I mentioned before, the greatest annihilation of Jews before the Holocaust took place in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Yet to this very day, it is not commemorated in any way. We don't mention Hadrian in the same company as Haman and Hitler. None of these historical happenings are mentioned in Pirkei Avot, nor perhaps in the entire Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers and their descendants were optimistically focused on building a new Judaism and didn't want to be distracted by current events. In my book, I try to present, at least to some extent, the historical context of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. I also try in my book to present the context in which I was writing, the epidemic with which we were all coping, and the political circumstances which plagued us as well. Very often, the teachings that I was writing about were relevant to the circumstances of the day, so that my discussion in Pirkei Avot also serves as a personal memoir of the 2.5 or so years in which it was written. Indeed, I include in my book many comments about how the teachings of Pirkei Avot have been meaningful to me throughout my life. That is, I personalize many of the teachings. Some of it, I should have turned my phone off, but now I can't reach it. I'm sorry. Some of my advisors urged me to leave out the references to COVID to ensure that my book would be timeless. But I also saw my book as a memoir, so I left them in. Let me give you 2 examples. Rabbi Tarfon said, "It is not your responsibility to finish the task. But not being able to finish the task cannot be used as an excuse for abandoning the task." We often face huge challenges, like global warming and its effects on our climate. We also face huge challenges in our personal lives. And it is easy to say, this task is too big. Why should I bother working on it? Rabbi Tarfon tells us to persist, not to give up. We may not accomplish our goals, but we should nevertheless persevere. And one model of this is Moses, whose goal was to go with the people into the land of Canaan, but God told him, nope, you can't get there. You have to keep leading them until it's time to go, and then you will have to die. I would often ask myself, would I live long enough to finish this book? 2 years ago, I was almost 80 years old and vulnerable to getting COVID. Thousands and thousands of people my age were dying. You all remember when that was happening. Would I live long enough to finish this book? Rabbi Tarfon told me to persist, to keep working on it. So I continued my efforts to write the book. A second example, while writing the book, I became very frustrated that my leg was not healing properly. And I responded by converting a teaching in Pirkei Avot into a mantra. Who is wealthy? Ben Zoma asked. And he answered, the phrase in Hebrew is Ezahu Ashir, who is wealthy. And he answered, Hasameach b'chalko, the person who is satisfied with what he has. I repeated to myself over and over, Sameach b'chalko, Sameach b'chalko. Don't focus on what's not working. Focus instead on all your many blessings and be grateful for them. Reciting Sameach b'chalko really eased my frustration at the time. Let me pause again and see if anyone has any comments or questions. Okay. David asked me specifically to talk about how my book happens. So let me say a few words about that. In the beginning of 2020, shortly, a few months before COVID, I started teaching a course on Pirkei Avot on Shabbat mornings for members of the Highland Park Minyan. Writing a book on Pirkei Avot was not at all in my plans. I was in the middle of 2 other books and I didn't want to forget about them. Once COVID was upon us, I learned about Zoom and decided that it would be a good idea for my group to continue my course virtually. And we met at 9 a.m. every Shabbat morning so that people could go to services afterwards. Since we were on Zoom, the sessions had participants who lived far away, who were not part of the original group. Instead of studying a chapter each session, we proceeded much more slowly. We looked at the teachings in much greater depth and covered only 2 or 3 Mishnayot each Shabbat. So Mishnayot is the plural of Mishnah, which is how each individual teaching is referred to. So it took us 2 years, more or less, to study together all of Pirkei Avot. Somewhere along the way, I realized that our discussions of Pirkei Avot were different than what appeared in existing commentaries. That the questions that were asked and that the interpretations that were considered went beyond the traditional questions and beyond the traditional interpretations. And so I found that I was actually writing a book about Pirkei Avot, based on my attempts to find answers to the questions that my students asked me. I never made a decision to do that, but it just happened that all of a sudden I was in the middle of writing a book. As you know, I've written some other books, so it's not, such an impossible thing for it to happen just by happenstance. One important point is that by looking at Pirkei Avot slowly, we were able to recognize Mishnayot that were related to one another, even though they were in different chapters. And so we were able to compare what was said by different teachers on each topic. That was very different than the treatment that one finds in most commentaries or in most courses. In my book, in addition to discussing each Mishnah individually, I refer on the same page to all of the Mishnayot that address the same topic, sometimes many of them. Beyond that, I have included in the book 7 what I call theme chapters that collect together and discuss all the Mishnayot that discuss 7 specific themes. So let me introduce those theme chapters by mentioning and then describing the 3 major developments in the Jewish religion that took place during the Mishnaic period. These were, first, the development of the oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral Torah. Second, the adoption of the belief in Olam Haba, the world to come. And third, the rise of rabbinic scholarship. Many Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot address each of these 3 developments, but usually they are not considered side by side. That is, when we study Pirkei Avot the way we usually do, Mishnah by Mishnah in order, we don't look at the text broadly. We don't get to see the big picture. The first chapter deals with the oral Torah. The first theme chapter deals with the oral Torah. The first chapter of Pirkei Avot explicitly claims that all the practices of Judaism that are not in the written Torah is the scroll from which we read to this very day. All the practices that are not in the written Torah were communicated orally by God to Moses at Mount Sinai and transmitted from the sages of one generation to the next without change over the 1,000 years from Moses to Hillel. This claim about the oral Torah is examined in the first theme chapter. Let me pause here again, see if anyone has come up with a question to ask. I know it's always hard to get someone to ask the first question. So is there someone who wants to ask the second question?
Yes.
So Laura?
Yeah, actually, Steve.
Oh, well, I mean, is there an explanation of how something could be so unchanged going orally over so many years. I mean, we know in a party, there's a game called telephone.
Of course,
Circle once and the meaning of something changes.
of course.
Yeah.
That's exactly, certainly one of the reasons why it's hard to believe that they
Right.
insisted that it was done word for word. Now, one explanation that is a reasonable explanation is that in those days when things weren't written down, people had to memorize things, that they had to rely on their memory. So we know, for example, that there were Greek storytellers who knew the Iliad and the Odyssey by heart, and they would tell the stories. We know that to this day, there are African tribes which have a person who remembers the history of the tribe and can repeat it, by words. So it's not completely far-fetched that they can do it. But as you point out, we all know about what you call the telephone game. And we all know that transmitting something from generation to generation to generation, it must change over time. So it's hard to believe that the oral tradition was exactly the way it was all the time, although they make the case in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot that was the way it was. And the reason they make that case is that they wanted to be sure that the practices of Judaism, which weren't explicit in the Torah, in the written Bible, had the authority of the Bible itself. Okay, they wanted to make sure, particularly after the destruction of the temple, that Judaism would survive, and the only way it could survive was by being unified. And so one way they say it would be unified is if we have a common law, which everyone observes. And moreover, that common law had the authority of 1,000 years of practice. So in my theme chapter 1, which talks about the oral law, I raise exactly the point that you make, as well as a number of other points. For example, nowhere in all, the first Mishnah in Avot says that the laws were handed down by the prophets. Nowhere do we have an example of one prophet saying to another prophet, "Let me tell you all the laws that I need to tell you." So there's no evidence for that claim. But nevertheless, that is the claim, and that's something that has to be taken seriously because, for example, those who are Orthodox believe that, in fact, all of the laws which we have and which we have had for the last 2,000 years are the Moshe Sinai. They were given to Moses at Sinai. Another question? Maybe now the person who had the first question we want to ask. No, okay. All right, so let me continue. The second theme chapter deals with all references to Olam Haba, the world to come. Excuse me for a second. And in the second theme chapter, I note that a substantial change occurs between Hillel's first mention of Olam Haba and the compilation of the Mishnah 200 years later. For Hillel, Olam Haba seems to be a reward reserved for Torah scholars. But in the Mishnah 200 years later, it says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem tzelek Olam Haba. Every Jew has a portion in Olam Haba, the world to come. That quote from Tractate Sanhedrin, it's not in Pirkei Avot, but it's in Sanhedrin, but it's recited before each chapter in Pirkei Avot. The notion of Olam Haba, the world to come, in part provides an answer to the vexing problem of the suffering of the righteous. The solution is that the reward for their righteousness will be in the world to come. However, it's not clear that all of the teachers in Pirkei Avot are on board with Olam Haba, since some still refer to the approach described in Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, where it says that the righteous will grow mighty like a cedar tree, and the wicked doers shall perish like grass, all taking place in this world. One of the sages in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Yanai, says simply that we cannot explain why the evildoers thrive and the righteous suffer, although the official explanation is that the righteous complete their suffering in this world so that in Olam Haba they will receive only rewards. The third theme chapter deals with rewards, which are mentioned many times in Pirkei Avot, implicitly or explicitly, but are not generally linked to Olam Haba. That is surprising, but it's also surprising that rewards are mentioned so frequently, since in the very third mission of Avot, the sage Antigonos states very explicitly, do not be like servants who serve the master with the expectation of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward. It appears that this sage advice for a person's relationship with God was rejected. If you study Pirkei Avot one mission at a time, you might not notice that rewards are mentioned 15 times. About the same number of Mishnayot deal with punishments. But those punishments generally take place in this life. If you think of Olam Haba as a solution to the problem of why the righteous suffer and why the evildoers thrive, you are only half correct. Olam Haba does address the question of why the righteous suffer, but does not solve the question of why evildoers thrive. Let me pause again and see if anyone has any questions about that heavy topic.
So Joe, could you share also, what does Olam Haba say about afterlife?
Well, that basically Olam Haba is the way Jews express, the way Judaism expresses the idea of afterlife. However, there is no comparable thing to hell in Christianity. Olam Haba is comparable in a way, in some ways maybe, to heaven. Not really, but one could say that. But there is nothing that's comparable to hell. So afterlife in Judaism, especially when it says every Jew has a portion in the world to come, so that means everybody. So that is so there's no, so afterlife in Judaism is not the same as afterlife in Christianity, for example, or in Islam, for example. I see that.
Joe, but they don't really define what the afterlife is.
No, they don't. They never get around to doing that. They never. That's sort of, I think, intentional. That there were some people who speculated about what that meant, but there was certainly no definitive attempt to paint a picture of what the afterlife is. I mean, for example, those of you who have read Dante's Inferno know that he had a very elaborate structure of hell, in which all sorts of different layers contained all sorts of people who have committed various kinds of transgressions. There's nothing like that in Judaism. Now, on the other hand, you might say, if everyone gets a portion in the afterlife, then why should I do good? I mean, I get the same portion as everybody else. So some say, well, maybe people get different portions. But again, that's not developed at all. So there's a lot to be said about this question, and I do have, as I said, a theme chapter on this in the book. And but the basic answer is that Judaism has never delved into this issue deeply as, for example, Christianity has.
And
One thing, let me say one other thing. One thing that's absent from Judaism is the notion that that's very popular in Christianity in the United States, which is that families are reunited after death. That doesn't appear in Judaism at all, and didn't appear in Christianity either until the Civil War, American Civil War, when so many young men were killed that the ideas of a 17th century, 18th century philosopher by the name of Swedenborg came into fashion, and that people concluded that they would be rejoined with their relatives. Of course, that's a problem for Christianity, because in Christianity, some people go to heaven and some go to hell. So if someone in your family goes to heaven, what does that mean? That everyone else has to go to heaven as well? So it is a problem in Christianity, but that has never come up in Judaism. Annie?
In terms of suffering, did they
Yes.
mention why the innocent suffer as well?
So they don't, no, so they're more focused on the righteous suffering. So the innocent is part of the righteous, because the innocent have no sins or have few sins. So why should they be suffering? So that is an issue. But they don't, the solution in the Bible is that things will come out correctly somehow. Maybe in the long run, maybe there are some verses in Psalms which say that you will be rewarded for your good deeds, even though right now you're suffering. But there were people in the times of the Psalms who obviously rejected that idea. And there's one Psalm which says, how long, God, how long will you tolerate all of these evildoers who are giving us trouble? So obviously the writer of that Psalm was not willing to settle for the idea that the righteous will be rewarded in this world. So that problem, the problem of the innocent suffering, the problem of the righteous suffering, has been a problem throughout history. And the solution that what they came up with in Mishnaic times was that there will be another life where all these things will be corrected. But it's not at all clear that, as I said, everyone was on board with that solution even then. It's also not clear whether people are on board with that solution today. So I had the following experience. I was doing a Shabbaton at the synagogue in Texas, of all places, many years ago, and someone asked the question. Many of you are familiar with my Siddur, and in my Siddur, in the Amida, where it talks about the resurrection of the dead, I note that I give an alternative that you can say that, I give an alternative for people who don't believe in that. So at this, it was a Sunday morning men's club breakfast, someone raises their hand and says, how come you gave that as an option? We all believe in Tchiat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead. And suddenly all the faces in the room turned to him, and he looked around and he said, you mean we don't? Because obviously in a non-Orthodox community, for most people, that is not an issue. And if you ask them, do they believe in it? They might not, but certainly it's not an issue. But within Orthodoxy, it is an issue, and it's very much adhered to. Other questions? This, of course, is a topic which we can speak at great length on, but I won't do that. I've talked about the first three theme chapters in the book. The fourth theme chapter deals with the importance of studying Torah. In this period, the study of Torah had become of great value and great importance, because with the destruction of the temple, the priests who were the teachers were no longer there. So they were replaced by those who studied the Torah. And since the oral Torah was becoming very important, we needed people who would be able to teach the oral Torah. Moreover, because it was very hard to maintain the teaching of Torah in the face of the Roman oppression, it became more important that we have a larger class of people who were familiar with the Torah and who could pass it on from generation to generation. In those days, it wasn't at all certain that Judaism would survive, because, many civilizations had essentially disappeared when their temple, where their center was destroyed. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion that we would survive. So we had to have a substantial class of teachers who knew the Torah. So the fourth theme chapter addresses the importance of the study of Torah. And the fifth theme chapter deals with balancing the study of Torah with earning a living and with doing good deeds. So at the same time as it was important to emphasize the study of Torah, it was important to remind budding Torah scholars that they had to earn a living, and that they could not ignore the needs of others in their community. It was also important for Torah scholars to avoid exaggerating their importance. As a result, the topics of honor and humility appear frequently in Pirkei Avot. And the sixth theme chapter deals with those topics. The seventh theme chapter deals with the ethics of the fathers. Not every Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is an ethical teaching, but many do have ethical content. While proceeding through the book, I highlighted the ethical principles that I found, and then brought them together and organized them thematically in a separate theme chapter. In keeping with the non-halachic character of Avot, many of the ethical principles are not presented as precise instructions, but rather as vague generalizations. What I tried to do was to convert the teachings into imperative form. Since many of the teachings in Pirkei Avot are ambiguous, they sometimes have to be translated into multiple imperatives. Let's look at an example. There's an often cited teaching of Hillel which says, "In ein anili mili," if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Nowadays, we translate this phrase as calling upon each person to stand up for himself or herself, and as calling upon the Jewish people to stand up for themselves. So the imperative version of this statement might be an advocate for yourself. However, Maimonides understood Hillel's phrase to be a call to develop your ethical qualities, which no one else can do for you. So the imperative version would be, take responsibility for your ethical development. Other commentators understood this phrase as, take responsibility for your own education. No one can do that for you either. The next two parts of Hillel's teaching are, if I'm only for myself, who am I? What am I? And if not now, when? And they fit all three interpretations. Very often peoples who are advocates for themselves forget to be advocates for others. And the balance between the first two parts of Hillel's teaching is ignored. Before I contemplated writing a book on Pirkei Avot, I studied Maimonides' commentary on Avot. And in some ways, my book is a commentary on Maimonides. Maimonides tries to make a synthesis between Judaism and Aristotle. But he is very careful not to criticize the ancients. not to criticize the ancient sages or the ancient Greeks. However, when he disagrees with what they say, he states his own view somewhere else, so that it is not presented as a direct criticism of the teacher. It's a very wise move he makes. For example, and this comes back to the question that you asked, he does not challenge the idea presented in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot that the oral Torah is precisely what was given by God to Moses at Sinai and passed down from generation to generation. But elsewhere, he describes how the oral Torah was developed over time. Very different. Although he doesn't say this explicitly, he seems to be denying that the oral Torah is precisely what God told Moses. My book at times is critical of Maimonides and at times of the text itself. Here's an important example. The Sadducees were the keepers of the temple, and they were the nobility of the Jewish people. They were called in Hebrew Tzedukim because they were descendants of Tzadok, who was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, when the first temple was established by Solomon. Sadducees is the anglicized version of Tzedukim. The Pharisees were an upstart group, in Hebrew, Perushim, literally those who separate themselves. The first chapter of Avot presents a revisionist view of history, that the Pharisees were the keepers of the oral Torah for 1,000 years, and that the Sadducees were the upstarts, rather than the other way around. Chapter 1 of Avot is an example of the victors rewriting history from their own perspective. Since once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees faded from the playing field. Here's another example. Rabbi Akiva says, Hakol tzafui v'hareshut nitzuna. All is seen by God, yet we are given freedom of choice. This is usually translated in other commentaries as all is foreseen. And the question is, why did that come about? And the answer is that came about because Maimonides apparently wanted to incorporate Islam into his great synthesis of Judaism and Aristotle. And so he accepted the idea in Islam that God knows everything that's going to happen, which is inconsistent really with Judaism's emphasis on freedom of choice, that we are allowed by God to do whatever we want. We can sin, we can do good, and God says in the book of Deuteronomy, behold, I have set before you a choice. Choose between life and death, between good and evil, between a blessing and a curse. We have complete freedom of choice. Freedom of choice doesn't go along with the idea that God foresees everything. God foresees everything goes along with the idea that we don't have freedom of choice, which is what Islam believes. So as a result, Maimonides gets into a philosophical knot which he can't resolve. Let's see. Okay, let me summarize here. My book looks not just at individual Mishnayot, but also looks at the big picture. It takes a broader view and looks at collections of Mishnayot that deal with a shared topic, both in the discussion of the individual Mishnayot and also in the separate theme chapters. It provides some of the historical context in which the sages lived and reflects the context in which I was writing. It shares how many of the teachings played out in my life. It compiles and organizes the ethical principles in Pirkei Avot and presents them as imperative statements. And it provides a critique as well as a commentary on Pirkei Avot. Finally, it is written in an informal conversational style, so it reads like a dialogue between me and you. Many of you I know have already purchased a copy of my book. I recognize some of the names that are in front of me here. I hope that you enjoy reading it, and discussing it virtually with me. If you don't already have a copy, you can purchase it tonight at my website, which is joerosenstein.com, which also contains many of my other writings. So even if you bought a copy of my book, I invite you to look through my website. So I understand that today's presentation will kick off the winter session of Congregation Etz Chaim's Pirkei Avot class on the ethics in Pirkei Avot, which David Strasser is teaching. And I hope that those who have not registered for that course will do so promptly. And so now I think I finished my formal remarks, and so we'll open it for further questions.
Before we go to any other questions, I just want to make a comment about, so what's so great about this presentation, Joe, is that when we have our class the next 4 Wednesdays from here, and people are reading your book, they'll actually be able to hear your voice and know your personality and who you are and your interests. I think it just makes it just much fuller in terms of understanding. So it's just a wonderful job with this. One of the things I like you to,
So thank you very much.
I just like to expand just a little bit more, because not everyone in this class knows who Maimonides was.
Okay.
But the other thing is, why do you think, since you're a Maimonides fan as I am, why do you think he decided to spend so much time critiquing or discussing Pirkei Avot? I know he did a lot of other things, but
no, it's interesting. He did spend more time on. He wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot. He also wrote a commentary on the entire Mishnah. So he wrote many other things. He wrote basically a summary of everything in the Talmud. He was a person with a photographic memory. I was at a session on Maimonides, where Maimonides had to leave. He was born in Spain, Cordoba, and which was under Muslim rule. But what happened was, sometime in his youth, the ruling class changed from being one that was hospitable to Jews to being one that was not hospitable to Jews, and he had to leave. And they did a lot of traveling. He ultimately wound up in Egypt, where he spent the rest of his life. He was a physician, and he was the physician to Saladin. Saladin is a historical figure who's very recognizable. He was the caliph of Egypt and Palestine and Arabia and all those areas. He was a very important man. So someone asked the question, when Maimonides left Cordoba, which texts did he take with him? And because, I mean, of course, in those days, they didn't have books the way we have it. So it would have been very difficult for him to take all of the Talmud with him. And so the answer is, he had everything memorized. He had an amazing knowledge of things, and he had an amazing intellect. And and he spent a lot of time on Pirkei Avot, because for him, an essential part of the synthesis between Aristotle and the Torah was ethical principles, because Aristotle wrote a book on ethics. So ethical principles are very important. And so he wrote an introduction to Pirkei Avot. It has the unimaginative name of Shmona Prakim, 8 chapters, because it has 8 chapters. He could have given it a much nicer name. But he explains how important it is, how about the goal of every person is to become an ethical person. And he talks about what he means by that. And then he explains, as he goes through Pirkei Avot, he explains how each item fits into his idea of what it means to become an ethical person. For him, being an ethical person meant finding the middle path between 2 extremes. So, for example, the middle path between being stingy and being being frugal, that's not to say stingy, that has negative connotations, between frugality and can't think of the word, giving away everything that you have is generosity. Okay, so he said, aim to be generous. And that was something that's right from Aristotle. And he looked at that each time. So for example, he raises the following question in connection with a teaching by Rabbi Akiva, who says that all depends on the frequency of your good deeds. He says, you can compare somebody who gives 1,000 dinar. Dinar was the Talmudic currency, 1,000 dinar to one particular cause versus a person who gives 1 dinar to 1,000 different causes. And he says the first one will benefit the recipient more, but giving 1 dinar to 1,000 different causes not only benefits the recipients, but benefits you more, because it creates in you a pattern of giving, so that you understand that part of your life's journey involves giving to others. Okay, so he's very concerned about all these ethical things. So of course he places particular emphasis on Pirkei Avot, because that's where the ethical principles are. But he knew everything about the Talmud and his Mishnah Torah. He presented it as a book, which if you study this book, you don't need to study the Talmud at all, because I have all the answers in it. A little bit chutzpahdik of him, but in a sense he was right. But they don't read him nowadays because there's some things he says that our university disagreed with.
So it's now it's 8 o'clock, and Joe said that he will stay on and answer some more questions, but his formal presentation is now over. So you're welcome to stay on, and we're going to open the floor to see if anyone else would like to ask Joe any questions at this time. Janet? Janet, can you unmute? Question? Okay, Jack?
Going back to where you began, why do you suspect that history, Jewish history, completely ignored the actions that the Romans took in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was wholesale slaughter of thousands of people being crucified every single day?
Yeah, I guess it's a very good question, and I ask it because I was actually, when I looked it up, I looked it up on the internet, so it's no big research study. They talked about perhaps 2 million Jews being killed during this period, and many being sent off to slaves in Rome, and many women being sent off to brothels in Rome, and all sorts of terrible things happening. And I said to myself, why is this not commemorated in any way? And the answer is, I guess that they, in that time, they wanted to look forward. They felt that they couldn't look back. And in fact, that's what many Holocaust survivors themselves did. They decided, and we may fault them for not telling their story, but they said, I just want to go forward. And they probably felt the same, that the pain was just too great to deal with. And so they just sort of went forward. But it is extremely surprising to me that there was so much destruction. Rabbi Akiva himself was martyred. I believe this took place at the amphitheater at Caesarea, which still exists. And I remember going to the amphitheater, sneaking in through the gates after hours, and sitting there and saying to myself, they did this to us, but they are gone and we're still here.
Right.
Yeah, and we're still here because these guys had some sense of optimism that they could create something which would last, and that if they dwelt completely on what had happened, that there was no, that there was no profit in that. There's a story that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went, who himself was smuggled out of Jerusalem the year before it was destroyed in a coffin. He and one of his students went to Jerusalem afterwards, and his student Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania started to cry. How will we be able to gain forgiveness from God if we don't have the sacrifices? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, well, it says in the prophets, what does God want? God wants good deeds more than God wants sacrifices. So we have another way of doing it. Optimistic. Yes. That kind of optimism. But we, from our perspective of history, we should recognize that more, and we should say that we should, when we talk about Jewish history, we should talk about that as our second Holocaust. I think.
It's just as a follow-up. I think that Maimonides is somewhat overlooked in modern times, except by those who are extremely studious. He was a profoundly controversial figure.
Yes.
Some considered him a heretic.
Yes.
Some accused him of
right.
Forced conversion.
Yes.
He did not have an easy life.
No.
By any means, but yes, he was gifted with a didactic memory.
Yes.
Which is a great gift.
Yes. I mean, and there are some things in which it's surprising that people oppose him. So, for example, one example which I found very striking was this. Nothing to do with Pirkei Avot, but that's okay. It has to do with Maimonides. Maimonides said that the question was whether evil spirits exist. Whether evil spirits exist. Now, in the Talmud, it's very clear that many of the rabbis believed that there were evil spirits around. So, for example, you shouldn't walk alone at night because evil spirits may capture you. This was sort of a part of Judaism's interrelationship with Zoroastrianism in the previous centuries. Zoroastrianism believed that there were two forces in the world, a force of good and a force of evil, whereas we, Jews, believe that there's only one force in the world, which is God. And so both good and evil come from God, whereas in Zoroastrianism, good and evil come from different places. So the force of evil had lots of evil spirits, just like the force of good had lots of good angels. So many of the rabbis in Mishnaic times believed somehow in evil spirits. Maimonides argues very strongly that evil spirits do not exist, that the idea of evil spirits is contradictory to our belief in monotheism, that evil spirits independent of God, evil spirits cannot exist independently of God. However, the next century's great philosopher was someone by the name of Nachmanides. Maimonides means son of Maimon. The next century had its most prominent teacher was the son of
Rashi.
Was Nachmanides. Rashi is before Maimonides. Was Nachmanides, and he argues that since the rabbis of the Talmud believed that there were evil spirits, they must exist. And most of the other commentators agreed with Nachmanides. So I picked up a copy of the most recent publication, very, very interesting publication of the Talmud translated into English from an Orthodox perspective. And they come across this question. This question comes about in the section of the Talmud that deals with Passover, because on Passover we drink 4 cups of wine. According to those who believe in evil spirits, the even numbers are evil and the odd numbers are good. So you never drink an even number of cups of wine. But on Passover we drink 4 cups of wine. So they had so they had to explain what the role of evil spirits were. And so what they said was, well, all of the great rabbis, they had an attendant who stood by them, and when they had drunk an even number of cups of wine, they would give them another one so that they would have an odd number of cups of wine so that they wouldn't be caught by evil spirits on their way home. So there's this discussion in the Talmud of this. And so in the interpretation, in this translation that I read, a very modern Orthodox translation, 15 years old, that's only, they present Maimonides' perspective very, very correctly. Then they present Nachmanides' perspective. And then they say, since most of the other rabbis agreed with Nachmanides, we have to say that evil spirits exist. So it blew me away. I said, how these guys are living in today's world. How can they possibly argue that way? But they did. So so Maimonides' view on that is rejected. Maimonides also had a strong view, very strong view, that rabbis should not be paid for their teaching of Torah.
Right. Because he didn't get paid.
Because he didn't get paid.
Right.
It's not because he didn't get paid, and he said nobody should get paid. It's against teaching Torah is not a profession. Teaching Torah is something that you do because that's what God wants you to do. It's not a way to earn a living, just like other ways of earning a living. And he points out that Hillel was a wood chopper, and he says, look, if other people would have said to Hillel, look, why don't you spend all of your time on Torah and we'll do the wood chopping for you? And Hillel rejected that. So he says if Hillel had the perspective that he should not give up his livelihoods in order to be a Torah scholar, then nobody should. Well, that certainly didn't go over very well with any of the other rabbis. So nobody agreed with that. And so for that and for many other reasons, as a friend of mine who's an Orthodox rabbi says, Rambam is not studied, Maimonides is not studied in yeshivas.
Well, I don't know if that's true.
Too many controversial things that he said.
No, I think Rashi had the best career of them all.
So, Howard,
He was a vinter.
Excuse me?
Rashi had the best career of them
He was
all.
a
He was a
vinter.
vinter.
That's right. He had a very nice.
Howard, do you have a question?
It more so relates to, I have some notes that originally everything was transmitted orally, nothing was written down.
Yes.
And what we were just talking about, those were from writings. Am I correct? Or was that also oral? Maimonides and
No, Maimonides was written down.
Okay, so the fact it was written, that those who disagree really don't have the ability to censor the ability to read it, to form your own opinion. But
Yes.
when it was just oral, there may have been many things that were censored by the majority
Yes.
that never made it to us.
Yes,
Uh,
that certainly is true. For example, once Christianity took hold, and I guess this happened once Constantine converted to Christianity. The rabbis censored the text of the Talmud to remove all negative references to Jesus. Out of self-preservation, because they were sure that if the Christians found out about it, since they were now in power, they would burn the books, as in fact they did, in subsequent generations. So yes, and there may be other things that were censored that we don't know about. And the things that were quote written, when I say the Mishnah was compiled in the year 200, we don't know when it was first written. It was initially probably transmitted by memory. Until when, we don't know. We don't know when it was first written. And there's not present we don't have a document which has it earlier than the 10th century or something like that.
Any other questions for Joe? Alan?
Joe, I picked up on your comment that you point out in the book when there's contradictory interpretations of a various Mishnah. And what I was wondering, can you generalize or give examples of what kinds of different approaches different schools might use? I remember, in my youth hearing about it was Hillel against Shammai. What were, again, I'm just curious in overview form, what would be some of the approaches, areas, philosophies that tended to recur as people wrote out their different interpretations and commentaries of the original Mishnayot?
It's a very good question. So I off the top of my head, I don't know how to answer that, but certainly I should mention in this context Rabban Gamliel II. So he was one of the 5 most prominent Jews in this whole period. The 5 are Hillel, who lived around the year 0, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived around the year 70, the destruction of the temple, Rabban Gamliel, who became the head of the Sanhedrin in the year 80, Rabbi Akiva, who was murdered in the year 133, I think, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who compiles the Mishnah in the year 200 something. Rabban Gamliel it's a very unusual situation in that he is not mentioned in Pirkei Avot at all. And so one question is why he wasn't mentioned in Pirkei Avot. Well, evidently, he was a person who got very angry. It may very well be that he witnessed the Romans beheading his father, who was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time of the temple destruction. If he wasn't a witness of it, he knew of it. And so he was a very angry man, perhaps one of the people who really had some sort of PTSD. Nevertheless, he was a very important person because he, more than anyone else, managed to hold the Jewish people together in the latter part of the 1st century and the beginning part of the 2nd century. And he said at the end, sort of as not on his deathbed, but sort of close to his deathbed, he said, "You may fault me for my anger, but everything I did was in order to keep the Jewish people together." So I think that was a major thrust of what all of them wanted to do, was to keep the Jewish people together. They didn't want us to disperse into different factions. So one of the major accomplishments of Rabban Gamliel, the second, was that he was able to end the battle between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. Now, it's not clear what was the major philosophical difference between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. It's often said that the house of Shammai were stricter and the house of Hillel was more lenient, but that's not really so. Exactly what was the difference, we really can't dope out. And further, and in subsequent generations, it's not clear that there were ideological differences that were very clearly defined. Certainly, one important thing that Rabban Gamliel had to deal with was that there were some rabbis of his time who were conservative with a small c. That is to say, they really wanted to go back to the way, they really wished they could go back to the way things were before the temple was destroyed. And And there was that constant pulling back in that direction. So even today, in the prayers, at least in Orthodox service, there's a yearning for rebuilding the temple. And we see that working out politically now with a new government in Israel, the idea that we can go back. Whereas there's always been a group that wants to go forward. So that's one difference that keeps coming up. Another difference that keeps coming up is a very interesting thing about, it's described in the Talmud, is that there were several very wealthy men in Jerusalem who managed to create storehouses in Jerusalem of enough food to withstand a Roman siege of 7 years. In other words, the only way that Rome could defeat Jerusalem or conquer Jerusalem was by making a siege. And if you could outlast the siege, then they would just sort of give up and go away, maybe. So there were these three wealthy men who had enough food and liquid and wood to last for 7 years. However, there was a group of zealots who wanted to fight against Rome. So they didn't want to stay put for 7 years. They wanted to fight against Rome. And so what did they do? They burned all the food. So that forced the Jewish people in Jerusalem to fight against Rome rather than withstanding a siege. So that's always been a tension in Judaism. What should be our relationship to the outside world, to the world around us, to the oppressors? Should we sort of go along and try to outlast them, or should we fight against them? And that's always been there too. So there are various themes that keep recurring, and but giving you more detail, I can't. I'm sorry.
Any more other questions for Joe? Well, Joe, this is a wonderful evening with you. I think it's great to see you. And
You're now muted. David, you muted yourself. Oh.
So it was a great evening with you, Joe, sharing your wisdom with us, sharing with us your book, how you developed it. I look forward to using your book with the class coming up. For the people in the class, I'll be sending an email in the next couple of days about what we will be looking at for next Wednesday. So
Thank you all very much.
good Rabbah.
And enjoy your class.
Okay, we'll be in touch, Joe.
Good night.
Bye-bye now.